Nia had always been the girl no one noticed. A shadow moving through the grand halls of the palace, a whisper of fabric as she swept the floors, an unseen presence as she scrubbed the great marble tiles. She had worked in the chief's household since she was a child, taken in as an orphan with no name, no family, and no claim to anything beyond the rags on her back. The other servants called her lucky, lucky to have a roof over her head, lucky to have food, even if it was only scraps. But luck, Nia thought, was not being treated like she was invisible. No one asked how she was. No one cared if she was tired, hungry, or cold. She was there to serve, to work without question, to never expect kindness in return. Yet despite everything, Nia had not let the world make her cruel. While the other palace workers sneered at the poor who gathered outside the gates, she pitied them. While the advisors to the chief feasted on roasted meats, she saved crumbs from her own meals in case she came across a hungry child. She had nothing, but she gave anyway. That evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, she finished her work and stepped outside to shake out her dust-covered rags. That was when she saw the old woman. She was slumped against the outer wall of the palace, wrapped in tattered cloth, her face lined with the weight of years. Her silver hair clung to her forehead in uneven strands, and her hands trembled as she held them close to her chest. A palace guard stood before her, frowning. "You again? How many times must we tell you? There is nothing for you here." "I ask for nothing but water," the woman said softly. The guard snorted. "Then go to the river like the rest of your kind." With that, he turned and strode back toward the palace doors, shaking his head. Nia's chest tightened. The old woman did not beg further. She simply sat there, as if waiting for something, or perhaps for nothing at all. Glancing around, Nia made sure no one was looking before she hurried to the woman's side. "I don't have much," she whispered, reaching into the folds of her worn dress and pulling out a small bundle. Inside was a piece of stale bread she had hidden from the palace kitchens. "Here." The old woman lifted her gaze, her dark eyes unreadable. Slowly, she reached out, taking the bread with delicate fingers. "And water," Nia added, offering her wooden drinking cup. The woman drank in silence, and when she finished, she did something unexpected. She reached out and took Nia's hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "Blessings return in ways unseen, child," she murmured. Nia shivered. There was something strange about her words, something that lingered in the air even as the wind carried them away. Sleep did not come easily to Nia that night. The warmth of her small sleeping quarters, usually a comfort after a long day, felt oddly cold, as though a draft had crept beneath the door and coiled around her like unseen fingers. She curled into herself, pulling the thin blanket higher, but the uneasy feeling did not fade. The palace was never truly silent, there was always the distant sound of footsteps, the whisper of fabric as servants moved through the corridors. But tonight, something was different. There were whispers drifting through the air, carried by a wind that should not have existed. She closed her eyes, trying to lull herself into sleep, but the voices followed her into her dreams. She stood in the courtyard, bathed in silver light. The great baobab tree cast long shadows across the ground, its branches twisting like reaching hands. Before her, a woman stood, tall, faceless, her form shifting in the moonlight. Though she had no eyes, Nia could feel her gaze, piercing and knowing. The woman lifted her hand, fingers outstretched. Nia stepped forward, an invisible force pulling her closer. She felt the air change, the whisper of something ancient brushing against her skin. A loud knock echoed through the dream. She jolted awake, her heart hammering. For a moment, she did not move. The room was dark, the only light coming from the small opening in the roof where the moon peeked through. Then she heard them, voices outside her door. "Cannot let this be known. She is here. Inside these very walls." Nia stiffened. The voices were low, urgent, belonging to men who rarely spoke unless it concerned matters of great importance. The chief's advisors. She slid out of bed, moving slowly so the wooden planks beneath her would not creak. Pressing herself against the rough door, she listened. The chief does not know? A sigh. No. He believes what we told him all those years ago. But the truth cannot remain buried forever. Another voice, this one more cautious. What if she finds out? A pause. She must not. Nia's fingers clenched. They were talking about someone who should not know something, someone hidden among them. A long-lost mother. A hidden truth. A sudden gust of wind howled through the corridor, rattling the wooden beams above her. She felt it slither beneath the cracks of her door, brushing against her skin like a warning. Her breath caught. Someone was watching her. The sensation crawled up her spine, sharp and undeniable. She turned, her gaze sweeping the darkened corners of her small room. No one was there. And yet, the feeling remained. The first rays of dawn painted the sky in hues of gold and crimson as Nia carried a basket of fresh water across the palace courtyard. The world felt different this morning, like a shifting tide, pulling her towards something unseen. Then, she saw her. The old woman had returned, but she was not the same. Gone were the tattered rags and the look of exhaustion. Her garments, though simple, draped over her form in a way that hinted at something grander. Her posture was no longer hunched with age but carried a quiet strength, and her eyes, deep, knowing, held a sharpness that sent a shiver through Nia. "You are awake early," the woman said, her voice carrying the weight of someone used to being listened to. Nia hesitated. I had work to do." The woman smiled, as though amused by something unspoken. "Come," she said. "Walk with me." Something in her tone left no room for refusal. Nia glanced toward the palace, but no one seemed to notice her departure. As they stepped beyond the gates, the village of Mbale came alive around them. Smoke curled from thatched roofs, women carried clay pots on their heads, and the scent of roasted plantains filled the air. But beneath the morning bustle lay a quiet suffering. Children sat by the roadside, their bellies hollow with hunger. An old man struggled to carry a bundle of firewood, his back bent under the weight of years. A mother sat in front of her crumbling hut, rocking a fevered child, her face weary with worry. Nia's chest tightened. She had always known hardship, but seeing it like this, with fresh eyes, with no palace walls to filter the truth, made her stomach twist. She turned to the old woman. "Why does the chief allow this?" she asked, unable to mask the frustration in her voice. "How can a village that feeds a palace go hungry itself?" The woman tilted her head, studying Nia carefully. "You see what others choose to ignore," she said. "That is a gift." Nia frowned. "But what good is seeing if nothing changes?" The woman smiled knowingly but said nothing. Before Nia could press her, a sudden commotion erupted at the far end of the marketplace. The pounding of hooves and the clang of weapons filled the air as the chief's guards stormed through, their sharp eyes scanning the crowd. People scattered. Merchants pulled their goods from sight, mothers grabbed their children, and whispers spread like wildfire. "They're searching for someone," Nia murmured. The old woman tensed, her fingers closing lightly around Nia's wrist. "Come," she said, her voice low. She led Nia swiftly through the narrow alleys, weaving through the tangled pathways behind the market stalls. The air was thick with the scent of dust and spices, but beneath it, Nia could smell something else, fear. Before she could ask who the guards were hunting, the old woman pulled her into the shadows of an abandoned hut. The guards passed by, their heavy boots kicking up dust. Nia's heart pounded. The old woman watched them go, her expression unreadable. Then, as if nothing had happened, she turned to Nia and said, "Let us continue." The palace buzzed with frantic energy as the news spread, there would be a feast. Servants rushed through the halls, their hands laden with golden platters and fragrant dishes. The air swelled with the scent of roasted meats, spiced yam, and freshly pounded fufu. The feast was an unexpected event, yet no one dared question the chief's sudden decree. In Mbale, his word was law. Nia worked in silence, sweeping the long corridors, her mind still lingering on the morning's events. The old woman's words haunted her, "You see what others choose to ignore." Why had she said that? And why had the guards stormed through the market with such urgency? Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden crash. From within the great hall, the chief's voice erupted in fury. Nia froze, her broom clutched tightly in her hands. Carefully, she stepped closer, peering through the open doorway. The chief stood at the center of the room, his powerful frame trembling with rage. His fists were clenched, his chest rising and falling with each heavy breath. Around him, his advisors stood with their heads bowed, too afraid to meet his gaze. "I have been betrayed," the chief thundered. He slammed his goblet onto the feasting table, spilling palm wine across the polished wood. "Someone dares to challenge my rule. Someone lurks in the shadows, waiting to strike." The advisors exchanged uneasy glances. One of them cleared his throat. "My chief, we have tightened security." "Not enough," the chief bellowed. He turned, his eyes sharp as daggers. "Find them. Find the one who threatens my throne and bring them to me. Alive or dead." A cold chill ran down Nia's spine. The words clung to her skin like damp air. She didn't know who the chief was speaking of, but something deep inside her whispered that she was closer to the truth than she realized. That night, as the feast raged on, Nia slipped away from the palace halls, her footsteps light against the cool earth. She found the old woman waiting for her in the shadows. The woman's face was unreadable, but there was a fire in her eyes, one that had not been there before. "The time has come for the truth," she whispered. Nia's breath caught. Slowly, the woman reached up and pulled the dusty cloth from her head. The moment it fell, the moonlight illuminated what had been hidden beneath, a symbol etched deep into her forehead. Nia gasped. The mark was unmistakable. It was the royal emblem of Mbale. A symbol only one person in the entire kingdom should bear. The old woman, the beggar, the stranger Nia had helped, was no ordinary woman. She was the chief's mother. Nia stood frozen beneath the moon's cold light, her heart pounding against her ribs. The old woman, no, the queen mother, watched her with eyes that seemed to see straight into her soul. "You are the only one who can make him see," the woman said, her voice heavy with meaning. Nia shook her head. I don't understand." The queen mother sighed and turned her gaze toward the palace, where the feast still raged. The sounds of laughter and drums carried through the night, but beneath it, there was something else, a quiet, creeping rot that had settled over Mbale for years. "Once, my son was not this way," the old woman said, her voice thick with sorrow. "He was a kind child. A boy who loved his people, who swore he would lead with wisdom." She paused. "But power is a venom that seeps into the bones, and he let it consume him." Nia swallowed hard, unsure of what to say. The woman's voice grew softer, as if she was speaking to a ghost. "He feared being seen as weak. So he hardened himself, silenced those who reminded him of who he used to be." She touched the mark on her forehead. "And when I tried to stop him, he cast me out, left me for dead." Nia flinched. The chief had abandoned his own mother? The queen mother turned to face her, gripping Nia's hands with surprising strength. "I have returned to test him, to see if there is any goodness left in his heart. But I cannot do it alone." Her dark eyes bore into Nia's. "You have been chosen." Nia pulled back slightly. "Me? But I'm no one. Just a cleaner." The woman smiled, the kind of smile that carried the weight of centuries. "That is why you were chosen." Nia's throat tightened. This was madness. She was just a servant, a girl no one noticed, a shadow in the palace halls. What could she possibly do to change a man as powerful and as cruel as the chief? She hesitated. "What if I fail?" The old woman's face darkened. "Then the village will suffer." A cold wind slithered through the trees, carrying with it an eerie silence. Nia clenched her fists. She had spent her life being invisible, cleaning the palace floors while the powerful feasted above her. She had accepted it, believed that her place in the world was to remain small. But now, for the first time, she had been given a choice. And the fate of Mbale rested in her hands. The scent of roasted meat and spiced wine filled the grand hall, mingling with the chatter of nobles and the rhythmic beat of the drums. Servants rushed back and forth, refilling goblets, stacking golden platters high with food. Nia stood at the far end of the room, gripping a jug so tightly that her knuckles ached. At the center of it all, the chief sat upon his great wooden throne, draped in crimson and gold. His laughter boomed through the chamber as he raised a cup, toasting his own greatness. Yet beneath the music and revelry, something felt off. A strange stillness lurked in the air, as if the walls themselves were waiting. Then, the doors creaked open. A hush fell over the room. The musicians faltered, the laughter stilled. From the shadows, she stepped forward. The old woman, no, the Queen Mother, walked with the quiet authority of someone who had once ruled these halls. Her tattered garments could not hide the way her back straightened, the way her chin lifted. The torches flickered wildly as she moved, her eyes locked on the man who had once been her son. Gasps rippled through the crowd. A noblewoman dropped her goblet. A guard reached for his weapon, uncertain. At the head of the table, the chief's face turned pale. "Do you recognize me, my son?" The woman's voice cut through the silence, soft yet unshaken. For a moment, nothing. Then, the chief leaned back in his throne and let out a slow, amused chuckle. "A trick," he sneered. "A beggar in rags dares to claim such a thing?" Murmurs spread through the hall, uncertain and wary. The Queen Mother did not move. "Look at me, Iduma," she said, using his birth name, the name only a mother could call him. "Search your memory. Search your soul." The chief's jaw clenched. "I know my mother is dead." His voice grew sharp, dismissive. "This is an insult. Guards, remove her." The warriors hesitated. Even they could feel something shifting in the air. And then, the flames in the great hall flickered. A gust of wind snaked through the chamber, though the doors were shut. A whisper echoed through the rafters, though no lips had spoken. "She speaks the truth." The torches flared violently, casting eerie shadows against the walls. The murals of the ancestors, carved into the wood, seemed to shift. Eyes that had once been painted dull now gleamed like fire. Nia's breath caught. She had heard tales of the spirit's presence, of the way they whispered when justice had been denied. The chief's fingers dug into the armrests of his throne. He opened his mouth, to deny, to protest, but then his gaze fell upon the woman before him. And for the first time, he truly looked. The high cheekbones. The slight scar at her temple. The depth in her eyes. Recognition flickered across his face. His breath came shallow. His hands trembled. "No," he whispered. The truth could not be denied. The torches sputtered as the wind howled through the great hall. Outside, the sky churned with dark clouds, flashes of lightning illuminating the carved faces of the ancestors that lined the walls. The storm had arrived, not of nature, but of spirits, summoned by the weight of truth long buried. The chief's face twisted in fury. "You come here to deceive me," he hissed, rising from his throne. "I will not be fooled by a ghost from the past." He turned to his warriors, his voice a sharp command. "Seize her!" The guards hesitated. The flickering flames cast eerie shadows over their faces, their grips on their spears uncertain. But before they could move, a single figure stepped between them and the Queen Mother. "Nia." "She is not alone," Nia said, her voice calm but unshaken. The chief scoffed. "You? A mere servant dares to stand against me?" But before he could laugh, movement stirred behind her. One by one, villagers emerged from the edges of the hall. The palace servants, once silent and fearful, stepped forward. The merchants who had been taxed into poverty. The farmers whose land had been seized. The mothers who had watched their children starve. They stood behind Nia. They stood behind the Queen Mother. They stood against the chief. A deep, guttural whisper rolled through the chamber, carried by the unseen. "The time has come." The air thickened, pressing down like the weight of 1,000 unseen hands. The murals of the ancestors seemed to shift, their eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. The storm outside roared louder, shaking the very walls of the palace. The chief's hands trembled. For the first time, the power he had clung to so desperately felt small. His gaze flickered to his mother. She stood tall, unwavering, her royal markings no longer hidden. She did not need an army. The spirits of the ancestors had already spoken. The villagers did not need weapons. Their presence alone was enough. The choice lay before him. Repent, or fall. The storm reached its peak, the sky splitting open with a furious crack of lightning. The force of it sent a tremor through the palace, shaking the pillars, rattling the great doors, and casting eerie shadows over the chief's trembling form. He fell to his knees, his once proud face now twisted in fear. "Mother," he gasped, reaching for her, his voice stripped of arrogance. "Forgive me." The old woman, regal even in her tattered cloak, stared down at him. Her expression held no triumph, only sorrow. "Power means nothing if it turns your heart to stone," she said, her voice barely louder than the wind, yet it carried through the great hall. The ancestors' whispers grew louder, swirling around them, their unseen hands shifting the very air. The warriors, the advisors, the nobles, none dared move. The weight of judgment pressed upon them all. Then, the final verdict came. A gust of wind howled through the palace, and the torches sputtered out, leaving only the glow of the storm outside. The spirits had spoken. The chief's reign was over. A silence, heavy and absolute, fell upon the hall. Then, a single voice, small at first, then growing, rose in a cheer. It spread like wildfire, from servant to noble, from warrior to villager. The people rejoiced, embracing, weeping, laughing. But Nia did not cheer. She stood in stillness, watching as the chief, once untouchable, was stripped of his authority, his voice lost beneath the celebration. The old woman turned to her, her wise eyes seeing far beyond the present moment. "Your kindness brought me back," she said. "Now, a new path awaits you." Nia's heart pounded. The storm had passed, but another force stirred within her. The world she had known had changed. And so had she. The night of reckoning passed, leaving the village in an eerie stillness. The storm had washed away more than just the dust from the palace walls, it had cleansed the air of tyranny, of fear, of a rule built on cruelty. At dawn, the village gathered before the palace. The people, once cowed under the chief's oppressive rule, stood tall, their eyes fixed on the grand steps where the old woman now stood. Though her frame was frail, her presence commanded reverence. The chief, now stripped of his title, was brought before her. His once proud robes were gone, replaced by simple garments, his face etched with the weight of his downfall. He did not beg this time. The ancestors had spoken, and their verdict was final. "You are no longer fit to rule," his mother declared, her voice steady. "Your people suffered under your rule, and now you shall walk among them, no longer as a king, but as one of them." There was no protest. The former chief lowered his head. He had spent his life running from humility, but now, he could not escape it. 2 warriors escorted him beyond the village walls, into exile. The people watched in silence, not with hatred, but with the quiet acceptance of justice fulfilled. Then, the old woman turned to them, and her voice rang through the morning air. "This kingdom does not belong to one ruler, it belongs to all who call it home. No one will go hungry. No voice will go unheard. And no hand that reaches out in need will be ignored." A wave of emotion swept through the crowd. Hope, long buried, now blossomed anew. Then, the old woman did something unexpected. She turned to Nia. "The girl who saw beyond power, beyond fear, she will help guide this kingdom." Murmurs of surprise rippled through the gathered villagers. Nia, the palace cleaner? The orphan? The one who had been invisible to those in power? Nia herself could hardly breathe. "Me," she whispered. The old woman smiled. "You, who gave without expecting anything in return. You, who did not turn away when others did." The weight of the words settled over Nia's shoulders. She had never imagined herself in a position of power, never dreamed of standing where she stood now. But as she looked into the faces of the people, the same people who had once passed her by, unnoticed, she saw something new in their eyes. Trust. She swallowed her fears, straightened her back, and nodded. The old woman raised her hands, and the villagers erupted in cheers. Laughter rang through the square. Children danced, elders embraced, and merchants handed out food freely. As the sun rose, golden and warm over the horizon, a new era began. And from that day on, no one ever ignored a beggar again.